Hey everyone, welcome back to Policy Punchline. Here at the show, we interview scholars, policymakers, and business executives about some of the most urgent issues and frontier ideas in our world today. I'm Princeton senior Tiger Gao. It is 2021. This is one of the first interviews I am doing for 2021. And in 2021, I've been thinking about launching this new segment called Aspiring Intellectuals that is under the bigger umbrella of Policy Punchline. We will interview philosophers and ethicists and people from all kinds of backgrounds and scientists kind of talking about some of the most fundamental issues confronting our society and not just narrowly defined as policy. And today I'm very honored and glad to welcome a very thoughtful philosopher and thinker. His name is Ewan Kingston. He is a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton Environmental Institute and the University Center of Human Values. He works in the intersection of political philosophy, business ethics, and environmental ethics. I met him at one of my recent philosophy seminars. He came over to discuss his very interesting essay on this term called joyguzzling, which we will soon dive into. And I thought it would be great to have just a far-reaching, let's see where this takes us kind of conversation about philosophy, environment, ethics. So Dr. Kingston, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for that very kind introduction. I should say Princeton Environmental Institute has just changed its name to Meadows Environmental Institute to fit in with some kind donations and stuff like that. So I now have a new name, but we do the same thing.
For listeners who listening on iTunes or Spotify, they might not see this, but we both have our Zoom background as paintings. I have some Van Gogh and Monet, and Dr. Kingston has some De Chirico. So we have some paintings in the background you can see on our YouTube video. But so some artsy kind of intellectual vibe, I guess. Shall we dive in, Dr. Kingston, about joyguzzling, this very big, interesting term that okay. I bet probably 99% of our listeners have never heard of this term. I mean, I didn't used to hear about it. Would you mind starting off by telling us what this term means, perhaps?
Okay, yeah. So it's a portmanteau, mashup of two words. Joyriding, not in the criminal sense, but just in the sense of going for a drive for fun. And then it's guzzling because you're not doing it in a new electric vehicle that's charged with renewable energy. You're burning fossil fuels to do it. You're joyriding in a gas guzzler, so you're joy guzzling. And yeah, we can talk about the reason why this is an important example if you want.
So basically, you wrote this philosophical journal article with Walter Sinnott-Armstrong, who is a very famous philosopher as well. And you're saying you're basically making certain arguments about joy guzzling, this concept, and in some sense we can understand joy guzzling as basically carbon emissions or polluting the environment in a way that is not necessary or just for the personal pleasure. Okay, can we broadly understand that term in that way?
Yeah, we wanted to defend the acts that individuals do that might emit, significant amount of greenhouse gases, but they don't have a very strong moral reason to do so. So you're not emitting these gases to go and see your grandma who's on her deathbed or something like that. Like it seems pretty easy to justify that kind of case. So we wanted to make things hard for ourselves and say, can we show that it's not wrong to go joy guzzling, for instance, or doing all sorts of other things that have high greenhouse gas emissions from a personal standpoint.
So in other words, if I and my mom or my dad go on a Sunday joyride to go bird watching or go see something just for the fun of it, this would be considered as joy guzzle under this definition.
Yeah, I mean, even there you might say, well, you're interacting with the natural world and there might be some important moral value there. But if you're, in our original example is like, you just like the feeling of the wind in your hair and you like the power of the car. But it's not important, to a great extent, like exactly what counts as joy guzzling, but just the broader question that we're interested in is, is it morally wrong? Is there a moral requirement to refrain from doing such acts?
Because there is a wide consensus, let's say, that climate change is real and individuals contribute to carbon emissions. but there are many people who say carbon emissions are harmful on an aggregate level, but individual emissions, it was very hard to pin down the responsibility. Meaning, if I go on a Sunday joyride, like you said, how does that tiny bit of emission exactly harm the earth? And that's kind of the argument you make. And you're saying that individual responsibility ought to only kick in when it comes to in an aggregate way, in an emergent way, and such and so on. So I guess, would you mind walking us through the broader framework of your essay and some of the arguments you hope to argue against?
Sure, yeah. So you used a really interesting word there, which is contribute. It's an interesting word because it could mean contribute in a causal way, or it could mean contribute sort of just being part of a group that has a causal impact. So let's have a look at that. So to start off with, my emissions, we could say, my annual emissions might be something like, 20 tons. And humanity's emissions are on the order of gigatons. So there's a huge difference in scale there. And all the climate science is looking at what is the impact of these gigaton level additions to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And they say, rightly, that this has a huge and worrying impact, and humanity should, definitely do something about this. Now, a lot of people would then say, okay, so, humanity is all of us, and the responsibility to do something devolves to sort of all of us. And maybe the harm of these emissions that are happening, the extreme weather and the expansion of disease ranges and the sea level rises, and the food insecurity, and the drowning of certain low-lying islands and stuff like that, all of this is sort of divided among each of us that emit, or emit above a certain level, or something like that. So you can kind of sort of take the whole problem and then just chop it up, like in an arithmetic problem. But this is perhaps to commit, to simply go from, the group is causing a problem to therefore each individual is causing a part of that problem, is to, in our view, sort of commit a kind of fallacy of division, right? So you could think about it in terms of, when one country goes to war against another country, right? You can think of the country as a group of individuals, but the responsibility, it's not like each individual has a responsibility for one particular part of that war. You don't always just divide some effect by the number of people in the group that's causing the effect. Especially when it seems like, as the title of some articles have it, my emissions make no difference, right? If we want to look at what's actually physically happening when I'm emitting my 20 tons of CO2 in a year, it's very hard to tell a story where that is going to actually make a difference to someone's life, whether I emit that 20 tons or not. It comes down to, at the most, a matter of, well, it might make, you might be able to tell a story where there's the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is, a tiny fraction of a billionth or a trillionth, more it's a part per trillion rather than a part per million in the atmosphere there. So there's a tiny change in concentration, but whether that transmits into a change in temperature depends on, what the photons are doing, and we're down to another level. And then whether that changes, the sort of the key point is whether that changes any effects on the ground and any actual floods, actual droughts, the things that impact people's lives. It starts to sort of boggle the mind how such a small fraction of a contribution could actually make a causal difference. So if there's not a causal difference, then things get a little bit tricky.
And I suppose, well, you also note this part of emergent property, which is that climate change is emergent in the way that like individual molecules of oil do not cause parts of the sensations of sliminess or the yellowish color. Only when the individual molecules get together, they make up the sort of the bigger sort of oil, and then therefore the oil has this property of sliminess or yellowish color. So in that sense, individual molecules of greenhouse gas do not cause a part of the climate change damages, and only when they get together they do, and it's very hard to pin down the individual contribution. That's another argument you basically talk about.
Yeah, so I want to be cautious about emergence, because emergence is a complex and difficult subject, and there's differing views on sort of how common it is in the world. But at least, as you say, there seem to be sort of some cases, like the properties of oil, where they're not emerging from the molecular level. So it seems like there are different scales, and phenomena maybe belong to certain scales. And I've been arguing in kind of these last few minutes that the phenomena of climate change is best viewed at the planetary scale. So in that case, you could say that it does emerge. Now, I'm not a metaphysician, so I don't want to sort of hang my hat on this idea. But at least I think we don't want to assume that it's definitely not emergent. And to me, I'd be interested to sort of hear from climate scientists exactly what they think about this idea, that with how sensitive the climate is to these minute, like several ton of CO2 level of changes. But it's not a very important question. They've got more important things to do, like figure out exactly what the feedback loops are and stuff like this, rather than look at these minute level changes, which are the ones that are interesting to moral philosophers who are interested in the individual level.
So Dr. Kingston, I guess one important thing to clarify for our listeners is that are you a believer of climate change?
Of course, yeah.
Of course, yes.
That's the difficulty when sort of talking about this stuff is there's almost a sense in which talking about the complexity is something that of the climate is something that has a history in terms of climate denial. But I think the complexity, when it comes down to individual changes, I think one can challenge that without challenging the scientific orthodoxy on climate change.
But are you denying individual responsibility when it comes to climate change?
Well, again, responsibility is one of these interesting terms. So often it's used in moral philosophy looking in a backward direction. So, Jones died. Was Smith responsible for Jones's death, right? So that's a kind of backward looking, what we are responsible for in terms of events that happened and pinning blame. And then when it comes to climate change, people sometimes want to say, well, individuals are responsible for the effects of their own emissions. So that's responsibility looking forward, and that's a slightly different issue. Especially since the effects of climate change are going to depend on how countries adapt to climate change. So it's not like there's some harm in the future that's there that we can now attribute to an individual, because it hasn't happened yet. So it's a forward-looking kind of responsibility, and it's not a term that we use in the paper. I think it's something that could be developed. Sometimes people mean by responsibility, they mean sort of like a weak duty. You've got a weak duty to reduce your emissions, and sometimes they mean something different. So I'm not exactly sure where we would want to go when talking about responsibility, but our claim is just simply that it's not violating a moral obligation.
How do you define moral obligation then? I think.
Hoping you'd ask that. So if you violate a moral obligation, then you're liable to a negative sanction. And it can be a legal sanction. It could be a social sanction, or it could be internal. You could be liable to feeling guilt or shame. So violating obligations is something that makes one liable to one of these negative sanctions. And so we're saying, when we're saying you don't violate a moral obligation, what I take us as saying is it's not appropriate to feel guilt. And it's not appropriate for others to shame you for a high carbon footprint. And that's pretty much it. There's a whole sort of range of other things we can say about the moral status of high carbon emitting acts. But we just want to say, don't go so far as calling them wrong.
Isn't this a classic collective action problem in some sense? If you don't see it as your responsibility to stop emitting or cutting down as much carbon emissions as possible, then someone else isn't incentivized to. And I think that gets back to the question, which is, do individual actions really matter when it comes to solving climate change?
Right.
And I think you were saying that individuals' actions might not matter.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's all sorts of different kinds of actions. So emitting actions, I think from the individual perspective, even matter. I mean, matter is an interesting thing. Like, they might matter in the way that it gives meaning to my life to live a low carbon life. So in that way, it matters for sure. But with regard to the collective action problem, it seems that, and this, you might know the literature better than me on this, but from what I understand, one kind of basic rule of social dilemmas, collective action problems, is that the more players you get, the harder it is to coordinate and get the socially optimal outcome, right?
Yes.
And we're talking about a collective action problem with, if we're thinking of individuals, billions and billions of players.
Yeah.
So it seems like, the classic response of having state responses and changing the incentives and changing the payoffs seems to be the way to go. You can't expect this coordination to sort of just arrive in a kind of bottom-up way that everyone's going to see, that we'll all be better off if we choose not to joy guzzle, so everybody stops joy guzzling. It doesn't seem to be that kind of problem that lends itself well to kind of spontaneous cooperative solution. So that's why I end up talking a lot about regulation and regulation and governance, basically. So we can start to talk about that.
Yeah. I guess you're making a very specific kind of argument, which is that, yes, climate change matters. Individual emissions eventually total up to be this aggregate emission that harms Earth. However, it would be very different to say your joy guzzling activity, meaning your Sunday joyride, where you're buying some potato chips in the market that will cause some carbon emission, whether that activity itself should be morally reprehensible or result in some kind of punishment in you. And I think you further make some arguments about how it's a distraction, because if we put too much more requirement on individuals and on individual responsibility, it may actually distract us from devoting it to political actions or regulations, which you believe are much more effective ways of solving climate change, and also really the key way, and not in terms of and we shouldn't be bogged down by this kind of individual don't go Sunday joyride argument.
Yeah, so that's a very nice summary. I'm just trying to think what I want to add to it. I guess in terms of the distraction, so it kind of starts from thinking that the overall sort of proportion of the population that might be sort of most committed to holding political actors' sort of feet to the fire on their rhetoric. Because right now we have, quite a lot of rhetoric about how we need to reach net zero emissions in this country, at least coming from, the Democrat side. And then it's going to take some sort of hard work to get there. And so there's a lot of work for individual citizens to do their civic duty. And this is something that pretty much everyone in the debate agrees with. Those who say, yeah, joy guzzling is wrong, most of them say, and by the way, your most important duties are your political duties. And people talk about voting and stuff like that, and contacting elected representatives and things like that. But I'm also interested in sort of the more fine-grained work of political activism, which often is sort of much more onerous than just voting, which sadly seems quite onerous for many people in the US anyway, but put that aside. But the work of like building coalitions, my favorite kind of coalition is if you think about the incentives that sort of right-wing survivalists might have to have, distributed solar in their community, and that might align with these, left-leaning green groups, right? So the work of sort of building those coalitions together and presenting a sort of united front that says, yeah, we really need to move quickly away from fossil fuels, is going to take a lot of work. And if we're super focused on not violating the moral obligation to emit more than, X amount of tons of CO2 per year, my sense is that distraction is one word, but also just in terms of depletion and exhaustion. I think people only have so much energy to give to the climate change problem. And if it really is a moral obligation to reduce your carbon footprint, then that's pretty serious. You should feel guilty if you don't. Other people should shame you, and that might end up taking a lot of energy away from what I see as sort of like the necessary moves of citizens to ensure that there's a just and effective transition to a low carbon economy.
But some could argue that individual norm change and individual responsibility are the first step to political organization and movements. In other words, we didn't count on, for example, in the civil rights movement or something, individual consciousness came first, and they realized, oh, maybe I gotta go help the people around me and not be a racist anymore, and that gradually consolidated into political movements that eventually led to passing of legislations. So it's a much more bottoms-up, gradual process of norms changing. Even today, in most progressive movements that we can think about today, it's the political Wolverton window, or when we talk about the social discourse, it's all about influencing personal behaviors and perceptions of issues first before getting any major political legislative consensus, which seems to be in an absolute complete gridlock today, right? So,
right, in the US anyway.
In the US, right? So one could say in the US, because it's so hard to see a major climate bill comes through, it is much more important to focus on individual actions, where at least individual actions and norm change will serve as the backbone, as the keystone to any political action.
That's interesting. So can you give me one more example? So the civil rights thing I think is interesting because there, the problem was, within a community.
Yeah.
And so the same kind of work of sort of realizing systemic injustice at that time sort of lent itself to, you could do that work while doing the kind of political organizing that I'm talking about. Like the two kind of fit together. So what's another one when you're talking about the Overton window? I'm interested in another example.
So when I was, well, as you know, I wrote my philosophy seminar's final paper refuting your argument. But so you must have read part of my writings. But when I was doing my research, I was talking to professors. I guess one example that people often give is same-sex marriage, that the Supreme Court or the courts in general track social norm change. It's to track public sentiment, and therefore they say even though there's no legislative progress made for same-sex marriage, that seems to be what most Americans agree on. Therefore, we rule the case. And well, we don't have to go into the whole debate about whether Supreme Court should be making legislative kind of changes. But anyways, but that's one example. Another example might be secondhand smoking. So in other words, it's not like the legislation or that said you shouldn't do seatbelt or secondhand smoking in indoors per se, but it's just that our perceived harm of secondhand smoking has really gone up during a window of time. Therefore, we don't tolerate that as much in public anymore. So these are all examples where, I guess, grassroots activism and education changed public perceptions of harm, and therefore that would eventually lead to any legislative change.
Yeah, no, those are good examples. I'm wondering if this is really sort of food for thought, but there's a sort of binary aspect to them, right? Like either gay marriage is permitted or not. Secondhand smoking, like you either smoke around other people or you don't, in a way. And it's a relatively sort of simple issue, whereas one's carbon footprint has such complexity that virtually everything we do has some kind of carbon footprint. So I don't put it this way. I don't think it's obvious that sort of every regulatory change starts with a shift in social awareness. I think some do and some don't. Sure. And I think there has been, big shift in social awareness in terms of the sort of the importance and gravity of climate change. That's definitely a shift. So maybe now it's time for regulation to step in and change the incentives for major players by enacting, carbon pricing, and then a few other things, maybe subsidies for renewable energy, and strong sort of adaptation programs and things like this. It seems to be, at that level where it starts to get interesting. Exactly. Yes. How we transition to the net zero sort of economy is going to be a technical question, and it's not something that sort of consumers or private individuals maybe have the best sort of grasp on.
I see. So you're almost saying that this is such a unpredictable, complex system that needs some kind of action to address it. The climate change is such a complex system, but to say that individuals ought to change their norms in some significant way, that's almost kind of a distraction, or like we don't know what the payoff would be for this kind of attention to or energy spent on this activity, whereas we could have totally spent that activity on political action or something else that would result in much greater expected outcome.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's not so. I mean, I'm basically an optimist at heart, and I think
really
the environmentalists will win on this one. I mean, we're all environmentalists now in one way or the other, but I see it. I see a clean energy future.
I see.
So it's just a matter of how quickly we can get there and things like that. But that said, I wouldn't be sure that sort of any particular sort of political campaign or any particular sort of coalition of groups or any kind of sort of political push definitely has sort of more chance of succeeding than another. And then I just see very little chance of a sort of widespread self-sacrifice of the kinds of things that we see as a sort of comfortable and interesting life, having high mobility and having comfortable living arrangements are two things with very high carbon emissions. Whereas it's relatively easy to, it doesn't cost you that much to allow, your gay neighbor to get married. It can cost you a lot to try and reduce your carbon emissions in terms of
I
the
see.
life that you want to lead. So sacrifice, I think, is a part of that.
So, which is what makes this such a different issue from same-sex marriage, because for me to say I support same-sex marriage or support that doesn't really affect my life per se, or it doesn't require me to make a huge amount of sacrifice. But for me to say I'm not gonna have an SUV, I'm not gonna eat these kinds of food, I'm not gonna eat meat, I'm not gonna do this and that, that would actually impose a lot of individual sacrifice that individuals will not be able to take, will not be willing to take up.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And for a lot of people, it might not be that hard. Like if you've got other reasons why you want to be vegan, like it's just
That's
a bonus
automatically,
that a vegan diet is
it's better for the environment.
Yeah, but for a lot of people, it might be quite a big sacrifice. And I think for almost all of us who travel, we feel that aspect, limiting our international travel, is definitely a kind of sacrifice. So now I just want to pivot back to the sort of other moral aspects here. So I said there's a lot of ways we can think about it. So one thing we say in the paper, and we probably don't say it like loudly enough, is it can be, ideal to live a low carbon life. There can be something, I think, in a way, sort of like beautiful about someone who's able to live like a happy and fulfilling life, sort of fully within their sort of local world, and they get by just zooming their friends who live far off lands, and they bike everywhere, and they're super healthy. Like there's something great about that lifestyle, and we can say, yeah, that's great. Like maybe you chose to do this for climate reasons, and good on you. You're showing sacrifice, and you're being an example of what's possible, and all these things. So praise is totally appropriate for these kinds of changes. So I don't want to get too sort of tied up in this kind of like, is it going to be a social change that sort of fixes everything? Was it going to be sort of like a top-down technocratic change? Because the social changes can come about by us praising those who go above and beyond. And so everyone's like, oh, I want to be like Tim. He's doing the right thing. And
rather than saying everybody is morally irresponsible or something in the
yeah, rather than saying that you're violating a moral obligation by not being like Tim.
I guess another. By the way, is that the positive view? Would that be the positive view of looking at things?
Okay, so what do you mean? What do you mean by positive?
Well, I suppose I probably got the concepts mixed up. We can go there later. But I guess my pushback wanted to say was, I was interviewing Branko Milanovic, who is this very famous leftist economist, and he brought up another political economist at Yale, whose name is John Romer, who has written very extensively about building cooperative economies through this kind of bottoms-up mental ideological change, basically that would not require top-down policy prescription. So in other words, for example, we now classify garbage at home and recycle, not because we are under some big brother watching us, we're under some kind of moral punishment, but we've internalized the idea so much that we just do it. And we can hopefully reach a state like that for climate change, meaning I no longer need to feel the moral responsibility to minimize my carbon emission, but I just do that because that is really the Kantian approach, which is the duty to perform such personal obligations or duties is basically comes not from the obedience, but from what I expect other people to do to me, and like that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it could have a lot of sources. It could be golden rule, or it could just be you do it because other people do it and it's normal. Right.
Exactly.
You do. That's the nice link between normative and normal, and like most of us want to be normal.
So it's still desirable, as you said. You should praise those who minimize individual carbon emissions. We just shouldn't kind of punish them morally in any sense.
Punish the ones who are not trying to reduce their emissions. Yeah. Yeah.
Dr. Kingston, by the way, so when you came to our class, I mean, when we first read your essay, everybody was obviously outraged in some sense, in quotation marks, which is that how can this person say that individual responses don't matter, whatever. Obviously, they didn't read carefully enough. I didn't read carefully enough about the nuance of your
I have
argument.
a different memory of this class, but sure.
Yes, I know. I'm saying in a very metaphorical way, which is that obviously it is nowadays the social norm is that you have to stick to the script that I acknowledge climate change. We got to do everything that is possible. The government should invest a lot of money. We have to do this and that to address climate change. So when someone like you that presents a somewhat contrarian argument, and without reading very closely between the lines and understanding the nuances, people could easily misunderstand you. And I think after understanding your arguments much more precisely, I have a very difficult time actually refuting it. Because you and that is your personal story with this as well, right?
Right. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. I want to go even further back than what we talked about in the class, but I was definitely under the impression that I had a moral obligation to reduce my carbon footprint as low as possible. And in New Zealand, where I'm from, everybody flies overseas once they turn 20, and they have a life in at least Australia, but more often Europe.
At least Australia, yeah.
And we call it the big OE, the big overseas experience. But I was like, this doesn't seem right. Like, it's not necessary for me to fly over there here, so I should enjoy New Zealand. And so I did my overseas experience like in New Zealand. And it was only like many years later that I actually flew to Europe and really spent time with my family in Europe. But even then, I was like, I want to travel overland. I don't want to fly. It's unnecessary emissions. So I was all in. And gradually, I think something didn't seem quite right about that. And when I got to Duke, Walter said, hey, I wrote this paper back in 2004.
That is your co-author, Walter Sinnott-Armstrong.
Yeah, Walter Sinnott-Armstrong, yeah. Said, I wrote this paper back in 2004, which argues that we don't have moral obligation to reduce greenhouse gas footprint or go joy guzzling. And you should help me write responses to my critics, because I've had a lot of critics. Like you say, it's a lot of people feel like, that they want to take this idea down. And I said, well, I'm one of your critics, I'm not going to help out. But over time, I spent a semester studying climate ethics with Doug McLean at UNC. And I set myself the project of trying to tell Walter Sinnott-Armstrong why he was wrong. And I came up short. I didn't think any of the criticisms held water. Especially, like you say, once you look at it carefully and say, we're not talking about like what to praise. We're talking about, who deserves blame. And that's sort of like, they're the big guns of morality, and whether you want to bring them out on individuals who choose to joy guzzle seems like a very important question, and one that even in our paper at the end, we don't say, therefore, obviously everyone is blameless for joy guzzling. We say there's not a good enough case yet to blame people for joy guzzling. And I want to add one more thing. When we're talking about this sort of changing social norms, we also say in the paper, at some point in the future, there might be a general social norm that you don't joy guzzle, or you don't take more than 2 flights overseas a year. And at that point, doing these things might be blameworthy. They might be wrong. But we're not at that point yet. So maybe we have sort of particular view about how that kind of social norm change happens, and it's much more in terms of picking out exemplars, and it's a kind of a slow change, stuff like this. Or maybe the government will fix it all if we hold their feet to the fire.
I see. Well, Dr. Kingston, should we maybe pivot a little bit to consumer ethics? I think this is probably what is related, which is that we talked about individual responsibility when it comes to reducing carbon emissions. So a lot of people would say, oh, when I buy products, when I go shop at Whole Foods or something, these products I buy are already tainted. They are already causing a lot of supply chain issues or emissions while they're being produced, and therefore I am in some sense responsible and blameworthy for doing that. So would you mind giving us some general outtakes of your thoughts on consumer ethics and what you wrote?
Yeah. So this was it was kind of work I was doing in parallel with that Joyguzzling paper, and I was thinking about sort of as you say, the whole swath of problems that lie upstream of everyday items that we buy. So, I mean, I don't know how depressing to make this, because people don't always think about sort of all the different problems, but most people have probably heard about forced labor in the cocoa supply chain. That's a big one. People talk about slave chocolate and slave-free chocolate. So a lot of the cocoa workers in Ivory Coast are young and work in hazardous conditions, and whether you call it slavery or not, it's often the sort of the level of consent is somewhat dubious. Their family might have encouraged them to go and work, and then the hours and the pay is very long. And then you have indentured labor, and you have all these kinds of things. Migrant labor is often exploited in this way. Laborers turn up in a country, and the boss basically just takes their passport, and then they have pretty much complete control over the migrant labor. So those are labor issues. Then there's environmental issues. You might think about deforestation with regard to palm oil and stuff like that. All sorts of local air and water pollution, especially in extractive industries like mining. You've got the conflict minerals aspect. So blood diamonds, it was sort of on a lot of people's mind when there was a Hollywood film about it. But it's still going on, and in terms of the minerals that are mined in unstable regions are often, you get these artisanal miners, villages just mining rare metals, rare earths, and then the local militia basically sort of taxes them. And then so, where these minerals go, they go into the supply chain, they go into smelters, and they end up in everyday products like the computer and webcam that is allowing this conversation.
Thanks for reminding us about it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, if you look closely at pretty much any product from a global supply chain, there's sort of some degree of taint, moral taint. It's associated with some quite sort of chilling processes and actions somewhere upstream in that supply chain. It's hard to know about. And carbon emissions is one of that. Some of the goods we buy have very high carbon footprints, and it's sort of hard to know exactly how high. So from a consumer perspective, there's a big question about what to do, and almost no one sort of argues for completely clean hands. But in a way, this debate about the reason why I think we're talking about consumer ethics is it's sort of shows how thinking about the carbon footprint of things we buy is just one element of all sorts of sort of failures of regulation that are upstream, right? Upstream of the products we buy, including the gas we might buy if we have a petrol car, right? That's not being appropriately regulated in the sense that we're not paying a carbon tax on it. We're imposing a negative externality upon other people. So that supply chain is not being regulated. And a lot of other supply chains are not being well regulated. Supply chain for cocoa is probably not being well regulated. And, numerous other goods. So it's a big question of what consumers should do in response to that. And yeah, I can talk about my response to that, but I've been talking for a while.
Yeah, please. And also, you also mentioned this part about channel on unruly benefits principle and
I'll get there. Yeah, for sure. So a lot of people sort of approach the problem as like, okay, so you're in the supermarket. How do you know how much to research about whether this chocolate really is, slave-free or not? My response is, let's look at it another way. Let's look at, assume you have bought something tainted, like all of us almost certainly will. What then is your responsibility? And I argue that you respond when you buy these tainted goods, just like filling up, the gas tank with this gas that you're not paying a carbon tax on, or high enough carbon tax on. You've received a kind of, I call it a cavalier dividend. It's a little bit of time or a little bit of money that you've saved by purchasing a tainted good and not seeking the sort of the potentially quite expensive, quite pure, locally made, organic, whatever else you like, very pure good, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to get started on organics.
Sure.
But whatever you think is the sort of paragon of sort of purity, right? It's probably going to not be the cheapest, easiest thing to find. So when you buy the cheapest, easiest thing that you can find, but it's got all these problems upstream, you're benefiting from a lack of regulation upstream. That good probably would have been more expensive had there been, sort of clear labor rights upheld in the supply chain of the chocolate bar, for instance. So you're getting this cavalier dividend. And I argue that, because of that, that's the sort of quantum of benefit that you owe towards political solutions to some kind of upstream unruliness. So for some people, it'll be climate change, right? Like they could take, and this is my vision, they could think about all the ways they're benefiting from all kinds of upstream unruliness, even carbon emissions, but also all the other ones we talked about, and channel it all towards, getting deeply involved in a local group that's doing everything they can to push their senator to vote for a carbon pricing bill, right? Like that's channeling the unruly benefit into what I call a fitting project, a project that might actually make a difference. Now that's just climate change, right? But someone else might be really motivated about the labor issue. And they might take all of the unruly benefit, including the unruly benefit they gain from buying things that don't have an embedded carbon tax in the cost of them. They take all of that benefit and channel it into responding to labor rights abuses in maybe even in a particular domain. So maybe it is about the chocolate supply chain. Maybe it is about the shrimp supply chain. Maybe it's about sweatshops in Bangladesh. But really finding out about the issue and seeing what NGOs are actually doing the work of trying to reform these processes in a sort of democratic and acceptable way, and supporting them. And that is going to take a lot of work, but I think I get a lot of benefit from buying things that are under-regulated. So I don't deserve to hold on to those benefits. I should relinquish them, channel them into political activity.
It's like the hedge fund manager that dodged taxes, so he donates his profits to nonprofits or something to help solve poverty. Not
okay,
the same,
well, taxes, yeah, okay.
But my point is, it seems that we're just
I don't want to
compensating.
agree with that. Like paying the taxes, that's a civic duty, right? So even though you don't agree where the taxes are going, you've got to pay them because that's what it means to be part of a democratic society, right?
Right, but my point is, the way we seem to be addressing injustices is not by rejection of causing the injustice in the first place, but by helping make up for it, because it's so hard to get rid of that. But
right. Yeah, I wouldn't say you're making up for causing the injustice, because I don't think an individual consumer, just like in the climate change case, I don't think an individual consumer of a chocolate bar causes, some percentage of labor rights abuses in the Ivory Coast, right? but you're
But you help
so you're not
sustain the
making up for
practice.
causing it, but you just have a benefit that you haven't completely earned.
I see. But do you think the consumer helps sustain such a injustice in some way?
Yeah, again, helping, contributing. Yeah, but these aren't the same as causing harm. So that's why, again, I don't jump to talking about moral obligations
Sure.
to sort of cease what you're doing or to reduce your footprint. We haven't talked about the epistemic issues of how you would try and figure out how to do that, but that's a big part of the issue. But even if you could figure out how you do that, I don't think, again, you have a moral obligation to reduce your footprint, but maybe you have a moral obligation to channel the benefits that you have towards political solutions.
Is that kind of like what Professor Peter Singer is saying, which is that you almost have a moral obligation to at least maybe use 10% of your savings or something to do some good, maximum the welfare of the overall society through effective altruism or similar initiatives, basically?
Yeah, so I feel like I believe I come sort of kind of very close to that effective altruist kind of way of looking at things, because I am interested in, what will actually make a difference, and that's an important part of the piece of the puzzle. And you might sort of, after studying where the best place to channel your cavalier dividend is, you might figure out that it's the best thing you can do is reduce economic inequality in a global sense, and you might channel it all towards Give Directly or something like that, right? One of these charities that Give Well recommends. But that would be, notice it would be for a different reason than what Singer's saying. So Singer's saying, look, we just have an obligation to do the most good we can in the world, right? And I'm saying, okay, maybe put that aside, right? That's an obligation. Most of us do quite poorly at it, right?
Yeah.
There's sort of maybe a stronger obligation to give up at least that portion that I want to be careful about this, but it's that portion of the benefit that arises from an unjust lack of regulation, right? That's a special kind of holding that you have. So, Singer's thinking about all the resources you have and not thinking so much about where they come from. And I'm like, look.
I see. That's a difference.
Yeah. As I guess, thoughtful, compassionate, conscientious human beings, most of us kind of care where our benefits come from, and we feel that taint. It might not be completely rational, but we feel it's not entirely justified for us to really benefit from that. And for some people, they want to shun the good and be like, okay, I'm never buying slave chocolate again, right? But for other people, they might say, look, let's think about that it's only a portion of this benefit. Like, the chocolate itself isn't bad. It's just been produced in an unjustly unregulated way. And so there's a portion of my holdings, even beyond just my general duty to do good in the world, whether I have that or not. There's a portion which really maybe I'm not justified in keeping.
Do you see this as a somewhat idealized view that is hard for the society to adopt en masse? So in other words, we maybe cognitively we recognize this is the case, but it's just very hard to implement it.
Yeah, so I think I did some. I think there's sort of the amount that I benefit from the lack of an appropriate carbon tax might be, a few $1,000s, right? And I doubt that I've relinquished that in an appropriate way. And I'm kind of lucky in that, I could be self-serving and say, wow, I'm working as a scholar, this is important stuff. But, being real, I think I'm falling short of what I'm advocating. But I think there's a difference. So you might say, well, Ewan, if you're falling short, if most people are falling short of this duty to channel the unruly benefits, isn't this just as sort of demanding and unrealistic as the view that says you have a duty to stop joy guzzling? But the difference is that there's always there's always time. There's always time to start channeling that benefit, and it's I needn't feel guilty or face social sanction until it's sort of clear that I have no intention of doing so. So I think it sort of fits much more this idea that the struggle to bring about justice, which does take work and difficult work of organizing with other people, political work, is something that we can sort of continually devote resources to, and this will be fulfilling the obligation. So it's more forward looking, I think, than backward looking. My carbon footprint has already happened. I can make incremental changes in the years ahead, but I could really move forward with channeling my unruly benefit and be liable to no negative sanction.
You are very optimistic in some sense, Dr. Kingston, because I feel like what is happening almost seems to be that we are forced to maintain a system of injustice or global supply chain or whatever that we don't really know how to get out of. And it's very hard to say that somebody is blameworthy morally for purchasing certain products. And as you said, because it's so hard to pin down individual responsibility and contribution, we can't really do much about it. So the best thing we could do is doing something what you're proposing, which is try to mitigate our impacts in a ex post way, in a post-sumptuous way, because it's not preventable almost by purchasing iPhones that are made by child labor in China. And by the way, that is illustration. That is not what's actually happening per se, but
yeah, the iPhone one is pretty complicated.
Right, exactly. It's like you can't get out of this chain or this cycle of whether you call it injustice or just bad things happening.
Yep, and it's complicated by the fact that a lot of the stuff that we see as morally abhorrent might make more sense if you're living in the society. The classic, case is, I don't know if you read that Bernard Powell book, Out of Poverty or something like that. He's an economist.
No, I haven't. No.
But, he says, look, if you're just worried about low wages in sweatshops, think about what the alternative is for someone who's taking a sweatshop job. It's potentially doing something as miserable as being a trash picker, sorting through the garbage piles to find valuable goods, right? Like so compared to that, a low wage work by a consenting adult in the sweatshop actually seems pretty good. So we're sort of pointing to the point that these problems are not like kind of easily divisible into here's the heroes and the villains, and our job is to always just associate ourselves with the heroes and to shun the villains, where the villains might be the evil sweatshop owner or something like that. So once things are sort of seen as more of a structural issue, you're right, it can be kind of daunting because you can see how long it will take for these sort of terrible, tragic situations to improve. But over history, I mean, they have improved. So, in the developed world, sweatshop labor, as we think about it, was rife, and it was gradually through, like labor movements and fights for 8-hour days and and good
because it
working
became
conditions.
richer and
Yeah, so there's a you know, like complicated interaction between the overall wealth and prosperity of a country and the labor standards that it has. You could talk about kind of where the causality goes, but I think fundamentally maybe part of my optimism that things will get better is looking back at history, and part of it is this kind of approach that, well, if we do just divide the world into heroes and villains and things that we should shun and things that we should sort of celebrate, it might not sort of be the best way forward. So sort of focusing on little gains, incremental gains, might be the sort of important way to go.
Dr. Kingston, should we talk a little bit more about the epistemic part of the problem?
Yeah, I touched on that a little bit. Yeah.
I guess so. You sent me the study of how bad people are at figuring out what reduces their personal carbon footprint. Part of the argument for the primacy of regulation is that this takes the epistemic load from individual problem, which is what we talked about. You get the taxes, regulations, subsidies. If you get those things right, you don't need people to have, self kind of epistemic judgments on what to do to reduce things. Likewise with consumer ethics, which is if you can get the environmental, if you can reduce sweatshops through regulation, you wouldn't need people to judge which potato chips to buy that are not from sweatshops. That is what we're saying, I guess. So if people are proven to consistently underestimate their carbon footprint, or just how they calculate how to reduce their carbon footprint, don't people say that you should let the free market work it out? You should let the people decide. The government shouldn't come in to take the action. So I guess what seems to be a realistic package of options that we should push for, let's say in the United States in the next few years?
So we're just talking climate change now.
Well, it doesn't have to be climate change. Sorry. I mean, I didn't mean to limit the conversation to that.
That's fine. It's probably easier, right? So, I mean, the point about the free market taking care of it, I mean, the obvious point is that most of the people being affected by climate change aren't in the same market because they might not be born, they might be in other countries and be very poor. But if they could, many people would pay us to reduce our emissions, right? But they can't. And so it's, we can't just look at the market for that. So then the question becomes, what balance of just a pure carbon tax or cap and trade system, which is just sort of putting a price on carbon emissions, versus more of a command and control aspect goes. And that's definitely like out of my wheelhouse. That's when you really want the policy of the policy punchline.
I see. Yeah.
But and I think you described very well the idea that these things are complicated. Like what balance, wind versus solar should be in the mix. We don't want consumers sort of clamoring for one energy company over another in the future because they think they've got the balance of wind and solar wrong in their energy portfolio, right? Like that's a technical problem, yeah. And it's not for individual electricity consumers to decide. That's why we have government. That's the whole reason for like representative, the argument for why we have representatives in democracy rather than put everything to referenda is the world is too complicated for people going about their daily life to really understand what will help. So we get a representative who spends their whole day learning about policy from their advisors. And so you have a whole network of people that are focused on these things, not consumers.
I see. When we talk about policy making, when we talk about influences, one issue people would bring up is large corporations unduly influences on political actions through lobbying with such and so on. And you wrote me this about a plot by Big Fossil, which is rumblings from the far left that emphasis on individual carbon footprints is kind of a plot by Big Fossil industry. And you sent me a couple articles that help connect the dots. And would you mind telling us a little bit about that part?
Yeah, there's a few pieces that have sort of come out recently, more in the popular press than the academic sort of world, where they're kind of telling the story of, I think, have you got written down, like, I just want to quote
is it basically saying that if individuals are focusing on their individual footprints, it is better for Big Fossil because it distracts from genuine political action like pricing carbon or carbon regulations that is much greater threat to their profitability?
Yeah, no, for sure. So, and the piece I've just found, the piece that I was thinking about says The Carbon Footprint Sham by Mark Kaufman, and it's in Mashable. But the I don't know, sort of how serious this is, but Kaufman makes the argument in that piece that one of the first uses of the phrase carbon footprint was coming from BP, and it might be sort of convenient for big fossil companies to say, look, this is a problem of individual consumption, rather than, as you say, back in 2004, BP definitely wasn't pro carbon price. A lot of fossil fuel companies now say, yeah, we do want a carbon price. There's probably been a kind of little bit of horse trading there, where the idea is that they don't have to accept sort of liability for damages in the past if they actually support a carbon price now. So it's kind of a little bit complicated, but definitely in the past, it could be that, I'll say that, it's kind of convenient for us to think of it as an individual issue rather than an issue of regulation. It's convenient for companies that are making a lot more money because there is no regulation.
I see.
Especially if people aren't actually going to change, like they might be promoting reduce your carbon footprint, knowing that, it's so hard to do, so people won't do it. So it's not going to affect their bottom line that much. Whereas a carbon price probably would.
This is a very progressive argument, I have to say, which is this is what progressive these days would say, which is, I mean, the kind of pro-business moderates would say, oh, look, the big companies are actually the ones driving investments in climate change. Therefore, we should work with these capitalists and people on the far left or the very progressive people would say, what are you talking about? It's all a PR campaign. They're doing their thing and they're maximizing their bottom line, and therefore don't be deceived by the corporate PR. And it's this kind of push and pull.
I'm in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you also wrote to me something, which I find fascinating, about gateway or dead end, which is there is an open question whether caring about your individual footprint is a gateway to further political action or a distraction from it, which is, we already talked about this again and again, but you also wrote to me, I think, which is one part I haven't brought up, is that it is fundamentally an empirical question, according to you.
Right.
And how do you, I guess, measure whether the conscientious consumption is a gateway to political action or a getaway from it?
Yeah. So the way that the article that I sent you looked at it, it was, just looking at like Belgium, and not even French and Dutch speakers in Belgium, but yeah, like Flemish speakers in Belgium, I think. And they used like a longitudinal study, and they asked them, which of these behaviors have you partaken in the last year? And they looked to see whether those citizens that sort of changed their sort of mix from being, like, how many people change their mix from being sort of not very politically active but consuming conscientiously to being more politically active, right? So if the conscientious consumption at time 1 increases the likelihood that they'll be politically active in time 2. And they found a small effect, which is the gateway hypothesis. It's like, yeah, there's a chance that getting more involved in trying to buy slave-free chocolate is going to make you potentially more likely to, I think the things they measured was attending a demonstration or joining a political party, or so let's look at those two ones, like attending a demonstration or joining a political party. One they called sort of like informal, like outside, uninstitutionalized political engagement, and one is institutionalized, joining political parties, institutionalized political engagement. And they found that it had a stronger effect on uninstitutionalized engagement. So you're more likely to go to a protest, and slightly more likely to join a political party. And I've sort of been arguing that this kind of, getting involved in the formal system, turning up to the electric utility board meeting and trying to figure out what's going on with that in your local jurisdiction. This is the stuff that we really need. But so it might be a gateway, but it might also be sort of a gateway towards seeing the world in more of a polarized, victims, villains, and heroes kind of way of looking at the world, rather than how do we get this done. So that's why I say it's sort of still open, is we have this one study that's longitudinal. There's other studies that show a correlation, but it's unclear whether there's a causal effect. But the longitudinal study is interesting, but it's very small, and that's just come out. So I'm interested. It's just sort of something that I'm watching to see how it goes.
I have to say I'm somewhat skeptical about the study. When it comes to these kind of empirical studies, I always feel like a large part of it is driven by narrative, which is that I already have a hypothesis in mind and I seek out to pick out the data, because also so many confounding variables, and it's hard to do statistics these days, to do econometrics and to pin down the actual causality from different correlations. So as someone who studies economics, I'm not fully convinced yet, but I see your point. I think it is just hard to measure, obviously, individuals' impact on carbon footprint, but also very hard to measure how politically engaged people are, because it's very unlikely that if people don't recycle, they'll use the energy to protest in the town hall. But there may be a small contribution, but I don't know. But I guess, do you think there's a potential for an opposite process in which, I guess, consumers who enjoy things like factory farmed meat or fast fashion or SUVs, they become resistant to change thanks to activism that moralizes their consumer practices, right? So that is something we've discussed a little bit, which is we fear that if you moralize the issue to such an extent, they will throw the towel once and for all.
Yeah, it's interesting to think. I'm going to take this in a little tangential way, but it's sort of easy to think that moral progress is all about moralizing things that, like we used to feel that, treating, like kicking animals or something like that was okay, and now we realize, no, actually it's not okay. They have these inner lives and deserve respect. We used to, society used to have norms where domination of women was accepted, and now we realize, like that all these kinds of domination should be moralized, and someone who tries to do them is doing something deeply wrong. So maybe, moral, and often we think about what things are we doing now that we'll look back on in 50 or 100 years and be like, oh, how could we do that? That was terrible. But moral progress also sometimes is a process of demoralization, that things that we used to think were terribly wrong, like showing one's ankles in public or something like that, now we start to see is not so wrong, right? So I think you're right that the more we sort of take actions in our daily lives in terms of diet and purchases and travel, and say, okay, these people are doing it in the morally right way, and these people are doing it in the morally wrong way. Those who are on the wrong side, given motivated reasoning, they're more likely to sort of reject the worldview of people that are telling them they're doing something wrong than they are to actually change their ways. And what's more, if they reject that worldview, then they're definitely not going to be pushing for the political change, and they're going to resist it. So yeah, short answer, yes.
Yes. So that was from individual consumers' perspective, individual's perspective. What about leaders? That is one of the things we kept talking about, which the credibility of the messenger. So for people like Al Gore or Greta Thunberg, should they be allowed to joy guzzle at all, to go on a Sunday fun ride, or for Al Gore to have, because a lot of people use that to criticize him. They say, oh, look at Al Gore. He lives in a huge mansion. He has a security detail of like 20 Secret Service agents. Why should I listen to him when he's causing so much more emissions than me? And there's obviously many ways to debunk that argument, but it's quite popular, this kind of argument.
Yeah, so it's if Al Gore is saying, hey, everyone, you should individually like live in small houses with low electricity, and he has a big house with a high electricity budget, then I think it's still ad hominem to come at him and say, like, therefore your argument is wrong. But he does sort of lose a bit of credibility, and I think there's something deep in us that is revolted by hypocrisy, and that's only human. So those who are advocating for lifestyle changes, who aren't making them themselves, there's both sort of common sense indicates that they're not going to be as effective, and then we have the study by Elke Weber's lab, and they're coming from Princeton, that shows it's the case. And then it's a more complicated one when if Al Gore says, look, this isn't about individuals. This is about, getting the proper price on carbon. And then someone says, but you live in a big house and I've got your electricity bill right here and it's huge. That seems much more obviously ad hominem. So speaking like as a philosopher, it seems like, the best response to that is, look, that's just a fallacy. I'm talking about a systemic response and you're criticizing my individual action. Like, these are completely different things. But again, there does seem to be evidence that people's credibility of even messengers calling for policy changes is reduced when people find out they have high carbon footprints themselves. How to respond to that? I think it's a kind of personal taste, I think, of the messenger themselves. I think it's perfectly fine for messengers to say, look, like I just did, I'm talking about policy. I fly everywhere, but, I should be paying a lot more for these plane tickets. And if I did, I probably would fly less. And it's also perfectly fine for messengers to really say, well, if I want to be a super effective messenger, I should think about how my actions are being perceived, even if wrongly. And so, Greta is the other example, and she tries to take the boat across the Atlantic, and he ends up probably with a pretty high carbon footprint because sailing across the Atlantic, I forget the details, but I know she's come under criticism.
Was because she took the boat. The boat was better than flying with an airplane. However, her crew, her team has to fly back and forth between the U.S. and Europe, and that ended up causing more emission. And people kept, struggling over this detail, which I thought, to be honest, I don't see that as a big deal. Which is like, if you're a public figure, you have your entourage, and they need to incur some carbon footprint. I think that is largely understandable. But I do think that, let's say for someone like Greta Thunberg, if she has the resources to, let's say, not eat meat, to become a vegetarian, to become vegan even, then she should do it. Or like, I do think leaders should be held at a higher standard because they have greater influence and preach. They are essentially preaching from a point of moral superiority in some sense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Greta Thunberg my point is, I don't think we should, they're still humans after all, but they should. Because
I think you wrote to me and you said, look, it's their choice to go into politics.
To
and part of the cost of that might be being held to an unreasonably high standard in your personal life. So two things. Like, I think that the debate about Greta Thunberg and the flying across the Atlantic thing shows just how hard it is to sort of if someone's coming with that ad hominem attack, it seems like nothing that she could have done might have been sort of enough to
that is absolutely true. Yes.
So whether it's a kind of tactical question whether someone can really have clean hands, but then there's a moral question as well. And I don't know if you remember this bit from the paper, but this is Walter's example, not mine. But he said, so think of an analogy. I'm a politician. I know that if I got a face tattoo, I would be a less effective messenger for what I put forward, right?
Yes.
So I have pragmatic reasons not to get a face tattoo, right? It stops me achieving my goal. And it might even be ideal for me not to get a face tattoo. But do I have a moral obligation not to get a face tattoo? It seemed like if I got a face tattoo and someone was like, look, you did something really wrong, you should feel guilty about that. Like, that seems to be an unreasonable encroachment into personal life. It's hard enough being a politician. So, the personal and the political should be kept separate like this.
That seems to be very different from the case of climate change, right? Because for climate change, in the case of face tattoo, finally, we're getting into a philosophical kind of objections and counter objections. This is great. Finally, an hour and a half into the conversation. But what I think is the face tattoo example is that, okay, I did something to my body, and I'm not really trying to use the face tattoo to send a message to encourage other people to do certain things. But for converting to veganism or reducing meat consumption or reducing air travel, you as a leader of the climate change movement, you are sending messages regarding how people should behave. Basically, you are telling people how to behave. And if this politician is, in the case of face tattoo, if he's preaching some policy about face tattoo or whatever, then you should live the life that is consistent with what you preach, right? For example, like Gavin Newsom, like the politician is he has to eat in some restaurant in California, and but if you're preaching about social distancing, you shouldn't have gone to the restaurant, and that reduces. You should have a moral responsibility to keep your word. So I think if you preach the policy and you're preaching a certain lifestyle, you should stick to it. Then you don't preach it.
Yeah. So I mean, in the Al Gore case, we were talking about someone. I mean, I'm not actually as familiar with the pronouncements of these people as I could be, but to the extent that they're just saying, look, we need, strong, we might need the Green New Deal, or we might need a strong price on carbon or something like that. Do you see someone advocating for a strong price of carbon as telling other people how to behave?
I think if they are willing to pay the price themselves, then that is fine. So for example, if you're a rich man advocating for higher taxes, you should be encouraged or morally permitted to do so. You can do so as your free will, as long as you actually pay the tax. There are people who advocate for higher taxes and they dodge their taxes. So that would be unacceptable. So in this case, if Greta Thunberg tells me not to eat meat, I think that is a very reasonable stance for her to take, as long as she doesn't eat meat.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're back to the two different examples of someone advocating lifestyle change and someone advocating policy change. And
I see.
Yeah. And the Gavin Newsom case, he was definitely advocating lifestyle change. So he, he should follow through in his own behavior, for sure. But most, I think the push for policy change is really what's most needed, and it's also what most of the political messengers are saying now. So, and that's a case that's much closer to the face tattoo, because if you're calling for policy change, then the fact that I have such and such a lifestyle is like the face tattoo. It's neither here nor there.
Well, there is
it's closely connected. I'll give you that. It's more closely connected, but I don't see a principled reason to say that it's so close that you shouldn't be allowed to have a high emitting lifestyle if you're pro carbon tax.
So you sent us this article by Daniela Dover, The Walk and the Talk, about hypocrisy.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, I read that a while ago, more than a month ago. So I already kind of forgot the argument.
That's more recently than me. So
yeah, we don't have to go into it. But I want to throw it out there in case some of our listeners are interested in that. But
it's definitely a good article. Yeah, for sure.
About hypocrisy, about politicians, what to hold people morally responsible and such. But I don't know. I guess the broader philosophical point, I mean, perhaps we can gradually come to that, which is, you said that there are big differences between Professor Peter Singer and you. So for Professor Singer, morality has virtually no limits. So any and all actions can be assessed against a moral background. And for you, while you are also a consequentialist like Professor Singer, you believe that there is an important value in carving out spaces in life that are immune to moral criticism. And in that vein, you are following John Stuart Mill. So would you mind telling us a little bit more about that? We're basically kind of gradually wrapping up with your overarching philosophical framework.
Broaden out. Yeah. And I'm an unusual kind of philosopher in that I kind of like start, with the real applied stuff. I don't even like the term applied philosophy in terms of like, you figure out some overarching view and then you apply it to some problems. Like, no, I want to really get clear on like what I should do in the supermarket line and whether I can, fly across the Atlantic just to see my friends, right? These are philosophical questions to me, so I'd kind of go for them. And the theory stuff is stuff that I sort of touch on. So let's touch on it for a little bit. So Mill is a really interesting character, I think, because he was not even a consequentialist. He was a utilitarian. He thought that, pleasure or the balance of pleasure over pain is the only good, and ultimately, right actions are those that conform to. This is at least one way of reading Mill. It's the way I like to read Mill. But then you don't want to assess every action in terms of whether it will increase pleasure over pain, because doing that will decrease the amount of pleasure in the world, because we're limited creatures. We can't figure this stuff out. All these reasons. We need, guidelines. We need institutions that set up to promote the good, to not put the onus on individuals every time. And we also need the ability for experimentation, because even our institutions are not infallible. we need to have experiments in living. We need to have people living different kinds of lives to try and figure out what works, what's best. And the way to allow that is to sort of limit what's the right word here? The sort of the power that society has over individuals. Because if conformity becomes the norm, you don't get people, these kind of eccentrics, which end up actually hitting on some really good ideas.
I see.
So that's one argument. That's like this epistemic argument for allowing people space to experiment. But there's also probably a sort of more direct argument that humans are kind of beings we are, or at least the kind of beings we've become in liberal democratic societies, just desire this kind of liberty, and liberty to get things wrong, and liberty to do what might be in a more sort of, in a society that's more driven by a totalitarian moral framework conceived to be wrong, right? So in a recent paper, I talk about totalitarian views of morality versus more restricted views. So there's multiple reasons, I think, why we might want room for people to have a sort of heterogeneous lifestyles. That's just a fundamental kind of like liberal idea, but it can come from a consequentialist view. It's not that there's anything really special about liberty, but liberty just produces good consequences.
I see. You said you're an optimist, but given what's been happening in the current events, politics, or whether it's in environmental science or climate policy, or what do you make of everything that's happening today? I'm not
my hot take on everything.
Yes, I mean, it doesn't have to. I mean, probably slightly more focused on what we're seeing in the climate arena, or consumer ethics or something.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so climate. I mean, I'll be really interested to see what happens just in the next few months. So there's a big question whether the work of the Biden administration is kind of taken up by a Senate trial. But if it's not, I would be surprised if there wasn't, big climate or carbon pricing bill, waiting in the wings. I'm not expert on the details here, but I know there's some that already had. I've heard that there's some significant bills that already even had enough support across the aisle to go through, but the problem was that Trump would never sign them. So just having the Biden presidency changes the situation a lot. You can talk about gridlock, but there is some bipartisan agreement on carbon pricing for sure, and that will change things. And then that's just the US. Other countries, again, I'm not as up to date on them as I want to be, but obviously what happens in emerging economies is going to be crucial to what happens with regard to climate change, whether China can continue to sort of have more and more ambitious climate goals and meet them, what's happening in India. These are the big questions, and so looking ahead, it's a sort of imperative that we focus on cooperation and assistance in terms of information sharing. They talk about it. Technology transfer is the word in the UNFCCC. And it's not always going to be, coming from like developed countries to emerging economies. Like China is really, that's where the real innovation on solar panels came from. So sharing the technology that's there will, I think, go a long way to making it feasible to have enough of an impact on climate. Maybe we won't meet 1.5 degrees, but we can do pretty well at getting emissions and temperatures down.
I see. Well, Dr. Kingston, I haven't figured out a closing statement or argument for the aspiring intellectual part, the intellectual part. But
okay.
For policy punchline, though, we do have a final question that we always ask, which is, what would be your punchline for anything what we've talked about so far, for climate, for philosophy? What would be your punchline at the end? It doesn't have to be catchy.
No. Yeah, just channel those benefits. Don't try and keep clean hands. Just channel the benefits.
I see. Well, in some sense, that is both a pessimistic and optimistic, a grim view.
I'm pessimistic that any of us can ever stay clean.
Yeah,
sure, but we know that the world is a very dirty place.
But we can do more. We can be positive.
We can make it so that we can make it less dirty.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but it's not about keeping yourself less dirty.
I see.
Yeah. Roll in the mud. That's
Yeah. Dr. Kingston, thank you so much. We would love to have you on the show, back on the show. It's any time when you have new breakthroughs in your findings. Obviously, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thanks so much for joining me today.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for your depth of engagement with the work. It's really good.
I haven't really engaged. Well, I would say I just ask questions. I don't actually know anything. I read your articles and I have a bunch of questions and I asked you. But yeah. Anyways, thanks so much, and thank you to our listeners. You may follow us on policypunchline.com, on iTunes, Spotify. As we're recording this on January 14th. We have not thought about actually launching a new aspiring intellectuals podcast, or we don't know how that will take place, but we obviously have the desire to introduce more fundamental conversations, whether in philosophy or arts or science, into Policy Punchline. So definitely follow us closely, and we'll try to roll out some more interviews like this with philosopher Dr. Kingston very soon. And by the way, I also write a newsletter these days on tigergao.substack.com. I send daily emails about economic policy and social discourse and politics. So you may find me there. But anyways, thank you so much for listening and watching today. We'll see you next time. You've been listening to Policy Punchline, a podcast generously supported by the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University. We would also like to encourage you to follow other podcasts produced by Princeton University, such as Politics and Polls by the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Policy Punchline is intended to be informational only and does not reflect nor represent the views of Princeton University or the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. For more information on subscription, donation, volunteering, or contact, please visit policypunchline.com. Thank you again for listening.